When Grant and his daughter Emily first arrived at their newly purchased lakeside cabin, the overwhelming emotion was relief. After years of hard work at his garage, Grant imagined this cabin life as the soothing backdrop for his retirement, a place where mornings would begin with calm breakfasts near the water, and afternoons would drift by as Emily organized their small yet welcoming home. Boxes were scattered across the porch. Tools were waiting to be arranged in the garage, and the moving truck had barely left the driveway. For a brief moment, the dream of finally finding a peaceful retreat felt real. The quiet rustle of trees by the lake seemed to whisper, "This is your chance to live in peace." Unfortunately, that fragile peace would not last beyond the first day. Grant was hunched over his tools, wiping grease from his hands with a shop rag when he felt it, the deliberate rhythm of approaching footsteps. His instinct told him this was not a casual welcome to the community visit. When he looked up, the sight confirmed his unease. Standing before him, clipboard raised like a badge, was Pam Weston, a woman neither he nor Emily had ever seen before, but who carried herself with the authority of a judge entering her courtroom. She projected power through posture alone, and for someone who technically wasn't their landlord, sheriff, or even friend, she managed to fill the whole property with a sense of intrusion. Pam wasted no time introducing herself in suspiciously formal fashion. She claimed to represent the Lakeside Homeowners Association and announced, in a tone that sounded more decree than introduction, that all residents were required to join and comply with community guidelines. There was a self-assured certainty in her voice that reminded Grant of overconfident customers who had once lectured him about cars they didn't understand. Only this was no bad car advice. It was someone asserting control over his property on the very first afternoon he moved in. And she wasn't just talking. She was recording. Her phone wasn't held casually at her side. It was turned outward, already live streaming, as though she had a wider audience waiting online to witness this compliance lesson. Emily, ever the calm thinker, didn't respond with anger or defensiveness. Instead, she counterbalanced Pam's aggression with deliberate firmness. "We'll need to review the legal paperwork first," she replied. Her voice was polite but anchored in authority, the kind of tone that comes only from someone well accustomed to handling rules and regulations. Emily had dealt with compliance issues before in her professional life, and from the instant Pam began spouting claims about mandatory fees and codes of behavior, Emily's legal instincts kicked in. Pam, however, was prepared. She thrust forward a thick stack of official-looking documents, pages full of rules, fees, and what she framed as binding obligations. With a smile that never reached her eyes, she began lecturing about mandatory participation fees, community standards, and lake maintenance responsibilities. To an outsider, the paperwork might have been convincing. The dense legal language, the highlighted sections, the seals and terms, all created the illusion of authority. Yet Grant could not shake the odd feeling when he remembered the weathered old sign he had seen earlier on his property. Lake maintained by state parks. If this was publicly maintained, how could a homeowners association restrict access or collect fees for it? The documents in Pam's hand, no matter how thick and complicated, already raised red flags. As Pam's speech continued, Emily carefully began photographing each page of the so-called HOA packet with her phone, a deliberate act of evidence gathering. Pam noticed and gave a passive-aggressive warning. Most people find cooperation easier than resistance. It was a statement layered with tone, a warning disguised as advice. To Grant, this didn't feel like community management. It felt like a power grab. What unsettled him most was the confidence in Pam's performance. She wasn't fumbling, she wasn't improvising. Every movement, every phrase seemed rehearsed, as if she had practiced this very scenario dozens of times before. She had backup paperwork, lines ready to deliver, and a willingness to live stream everything in real time to cultivate either sympathy or intimidation. The entire encounter blurred the line between community organization and theater, with Pam as the self-appointed director and Grant and Emily being forced into unwanted roles. When Pam finally left that first day, Grant and Emily were left staring at the mountain of paperwork she had deposited at their kitchen table. It was filled with rules about vehicles, lawns, and community behavior, rules they'd never agreed to, rules that clashed with the reality of state jurisdiction over the lake. Alone with the stack of documents, Grant realized that what was supposed to be his quiet weekend retreat had already become unsettled. That first encounter served as a chilling introduction, not only to Pam but to the darkness that lurked behind her polished clipboard and forced smile. She hadn't simply dropped by with cookies or a welcome basket. She had arrived claiming ownership, authority, and a right to control them. In hindsight, this confrontation wasn't just an unusual neighborly interaction. It was the opening move of a much larger game, one that would stretch from fake violations to vandalism, intimidation, and eventually, full-blown criminal exposure. But on that very first day, as the lake shimmered in the distance and sunset colored their porch, all Grant knew was this: his dream of peace had been hijacked before it even began. The first meeting with Pam had already left Grant and Emily unsettled, but what followed in the days after moved from strange neighbor behavior into something far more sinister. Instead of embracing their new lakeside cabin and settling into a slower rhythm, they found themselves thrown into a campaign of harassment that escalated with each passing day. It began deceptively small, a notice taped to their mailbox the next morning. When Grant squinted at it through his coffee steam, he saw an official violation warning claiming his mechanical tools were improperly stored in community view. He laughed in disbelief. The tools were sitting neatly inside his garage. Hardly a crime worth documenting. Then came the kicker. Another violation claiming their yard had failed to meet community grass height standards. Grass? They had lived there exactly 3 days. The lawn hadn't even had a chance to grow. Confused turned to anger when Grant realized these notices weren't simply dropped discreetly. They'd been plastered everywhere. His front door, the garage entrance, even under the wipers of his truck, in a theatrical display meant to embarrass them. It wasn't just about paperwork. It was about performing power. And sure enough, when Grant glanced out the kitchen window, he saw Pam doing exactly that. Phone in hand, she was live-streaming the entire process, narrating like a self-aggrandized officer teaching proper authority to her audience. This public performance of compliance enforcement made the situation sting even more. Neighbors who had barely introduced themselves were now seeing Grant and Emily in a humiliating spotlight, being framed as the problem residents. Pam wasn't only writing notices, she was planting seeds of doubt in the community, turning their peaceful retreat into a stage for her content creation. Every violation wasn't just a threat. It was a post, a video, a performance designed to portray them as rebels against community harmony. What could have remained laughable soon became alarming. One morning, Grant inspected his truck only to find something far beyond a passive-aggressive note. The rubber of his tire had been punctured by industrial-grade staples, embedded so deliberately they could not have been accidental. As a mechanic, Grant knew the difference between a stray nail from the road and intentional sabotage. This wasn't vandalism for spite, it was sabotage with precision. The stakes had risen sharply. Pam, or someone acting on her behalf, had crossed the line from harassment into criminal damage. Emily recognized these actions for what they were: escalation tactics. Her approach was calm, steady, and methodical. She began documenting everything, photographing notices, storing security footage, and keeping timestamps. Grant noticed how effortlessly she slipped into this role, as though she had trained for exactly this kind of intimidation. Meanwhile, Pam escalated her psychological tactics. Community-wide emails began circulating, written in her condescending tone, warning neighbors that the newcomers lacked respect for community standards. No direct accusations, but heavy suggestion. Through carefully crafted gossip, she painted Grant and Emily as disruptive, dangerous even, without giving them a fair chance to counter. The neighbors grew more distant. People who had smiled during their first introductions now avoided eye contact. Conversations halted when Grant walked into the convenience store, and Emily was whispered about like a suspicious outsider. Pam had managed to isolate them socially before they had even placed their family photos on the walls inside their cabin. Yet Grant's unease went deeper than social rejection. Late at night, their doorbell camera captured shadowy hands rifling through their mailbox. Whoever it was dropped a clipboard in the rush, then disappeared into the darkness. Was it Pam? One of her assistants? It didn't matter. The message was clear. What should have been private correspondence was being tampered with, stolen, and weaponized. Their home was no longer secure, it was under surveillance, intrusion, and violation. The intimidation didn't stop there. A tow truck began circling their block repeatedly, slowing in front of their driveway, studying their vehicles, then speeding off when Grant stepped outside. It wasn't a one-time event. It happened multiple times at different hours, almost like a patrol designed to test their responses. Combined with the deliberate sabotage of his tires, it confirmed to Grant that this wasn't random hostility. It was a coordinated attempt to frighten them into compliance. Even Pam's threats grew sharper with each encounter. Most people choose cooperation, she told Emily after spotting her photographing the HOA papers, because resistance always ends poorly. The words froze Grant for a moment, not because of the phrasing but because of the quiet certainty in Pam's voice. She wasn't bluffing. She expected them to fold, and she had done this long enough that she was confident the outcome would bend toward her control. If the frivolous notices were the nibble, the vandalism and mail theft were the teeth sinking in. Grant could feel the trap tightening around them, but Emily's steadiness reminded him not to panic. She reminded him gently but firmly that everything Pam did only provided more evidence. "Paper trails can be burned," Emily said once, "but digital records live forever." And with each violation, each video, each sabotage attempt, Pam was building a mountain of evidence against herself. Still, even with the cool-headed planning, Grant couldn't shake the unease at night. As he checked the locks on the cabin windows, he realized the tranquil retreat he'd dreamed of was gone, at least for now. They weren't living by the peaceful lake as they'd hoped. They were living under siege. And Pam Weston, with her endless stream of notices, emails, and threats, wasn't just a difficult neighbor anymore. She had become the drumbeat of intimidation, forcing them step by step into a battle they never wanted but could no longer avoid. What had started as harassment through paperwork and sabotage was, by now, clearly building into something much larger. Grant knew from his decades of working in garages that instincts counted. Engines made warning sounds before failing, just as people revealed cracks in their stories before their lies fully collapsed. And his instincts told him plainly. Pam wasn't simply an overzealous neighbor who enjoyed playing hall monitor. No, this was something organized, something rehearsed, something designed for profit. That gut feeling came into sharp relief during the so-called community meeting, held in what Pam grandly declared to be the compliance review. The atmosphere was heavy from the moment Grant and Emily walked into the community center. Folding chairs were arranged like benches in a courtroom, all facing a long table where Pam sat, flanked by a new figure, Alan Harper. He introduced himself with self-satisfied confidence, announcing he was a documentation specialist. The words sounded deliberately vague, much like those customers Grant remembered who came into his garage claiming they were mechanical experts, but couldn't even identify a carburetor. Alan carried himself with the smug assurance of someone rehearsed in jargon but not in truth. Spread in front of him was a stack of contracts so thick it looked more like ammunition than paperwork. Grant immediately noted something strange. The letterheads on the pages didn't match. Some bore the names of organizations from Texas, others from California, another even referenced Florida housing codes, hundreds of miles away, and clearly irrelevant to their lakeside community. Alan made a theatrical presentation, flicking through slides and waving papers as though the sheer volume of documents created legitimacy. But anyone paying attention could see. This wasn't professional governance. It was a patchwork quilt of stolen templates, modified only enough to plaster Lakeside across the headers. Pam nodded along during Alan's speech, reveling in her role as neighborhood authority, but Emily's expression hardened with each inconsistent claim. Where Grant once saw just his careful, detail-oriented daughter, now he saw someone with razor-sharp precision, dissecting every flaw in real time. Emily leaned forward, pen scratching notes, eyebrows arching every time Alan skipped past key legal details. When Alan mentioned resident compliance fees without defining where the funds were legally deposited, Grant caught something else, a nervous shuffle of papers, his hand covering a small emblem on his lapel. It was the very same icon Pam had emblazoned across her HOA headers, a not-so-subtle signal that this man wasn't independent at all, but part of her operation. The unraveling moment came with the QR codes. Alan confidently handed out sheets that supposedly linked to financial records and official HOA documentation. Emily, without fanfare, scanned one with her phone under the table. When the URL popped up, she nearly laughed despite the tension. It didn't go to any government site or even a legitimate HOA platform. Instead, it pointed to a personal PayPal account labeled pwwweston.community. Pam Weston's financial slush fund, thinly disguised. Grant, though not trained in law, understood enough about real business to recognize fraud staring him in the face. No official homeowners association would ever funnel thousands of dollars into a personal PayPal account. Alan caught the scanning motion, stuttered for a moment, and hurriedly claimed they were updating technical systems. But his nervousness bled into his voice, exposing the practiced calm as only surface polish. Beneath, panic was already rising. To Emily, every inconsistency became fuel. This wasn't simply an aggressive neighbor with an inflated ego. This was a scheme designed to defraud multiple residents of their money using forged authority and fake legal documents. Pam, sensing the momentum slipping, doubled down on intimidation. "Most residents find cooperation easier," she repeated, now directing the words to the entire room as though to rally the others against Grant and Emily. But something shifted in that room. The neighbors who had once whispered and avoided them started exchanging uncertain glances. Emily's calm, specific questions about legal incorporation, state registration, fiduciary responsibility landed with precision, while Pam and Alan stumbled through vague answers. Doubt crept into the eyes of the crowd. The seeds of manipulation Pam had planted were beginning to die under the weight of truth. What cemented the suspicion was Alan himself. For someone claiming to be a specialist, he could not explain even the basics: how dues were calculated, how budgets were audited, or what actual state law permitted this HOA's authority. He clung to jargon, throwing around words like compliance structures and integrated processes, but without substance. And in that emptiness, Emily's competence shone brighter than ever. The deeper Grant observed, the clearer the bigger picture became. This wasn't about lawn standards or garage tools. This was about money and power, a fabricated HOA built on intimidation and smoke and mirror documentation, extracting payments from frightened homeowners. Pam played the role of local enforcer, barking rules and delivering threats. Alan was the architect of the con, supplying fraudulent paperwork and digital trails that gave shape to their fiction. Together, they had constructed a convincing lie. But like all frauds, once someone doubted the foundation, the whole building trembled. The mismatched paperwork from other states, the personal PayPal link, the refusal to reveal financial transparency, it all cracked the illusion. Emily had begun systematically exposing the scheme in real time, and though the crowd wasn't yet rallying against Pam, they weren't blindly following her anymore either. That night, as Grant replayed the meeting in his head, he realized this was far bigger than one hostile neighbor. This was organized, methodical fraud, and Emily had just yanked the thread that could unravel the entire scheme. What Pam had framed as community management was, in truth, little more than a predatory business, one built on fear, coercion, and fabricated authority. Pam had the clipboard and the swagger, but Alan had shown them the real machinery behind it, a blueprint of deception different only in setting, not in pattern. Grant now understood with chilling certainty. They weren't simply in conflict with a bad neighbor. They had stumbled into the center of a criminal enterprise, and whether the neighbors realized it yet or not, their entire lakeside community was sitting inside one long, carefully staged scam. By the time the resolution conference was announced, Grant and Emily both knew the charade was nearing collapse. Pam and Alan had been squeezing every ounce of pressure possible. Fabricated violations, vehicle sabotage, surveillance tactics, whispered rumors, and even mandatory volunteer tasks disguised as punishment. But what finally shattered any illusion of simply playing community politics was Pam's willingness to escalate beyond paperwork or intimidation. The first unmistakable sign came late one evening, when Emily decided to jog along the lakeside trail. The quiet path meant to offer calm reflection turned into something far more threatening. As she ran, headlights appeared, Pam's SUV moving slowly behind her. Every time Emily slowed down, so did the vehicle. Every time she sped up, the SUV shadowed her steps. By the time Emily reached the isolated wooden dock, Pam had positioned her car to cut off access. Stepping out with cold calculation, Pam leaned just enough into the open door for Emily to notice the dark outline of a firearm resting in the console. Her voice was steady, menacing. "Compliance here isn't optional. You'll learn one way or another." Though Pam never pointed the gun, displaying it at all was enough to obliterate any last pretense of neighborly education. Emily returned to the cabin, without panic but with a resolute expression that told Grant this was no longer about an eccentric neighbor. It had become a criminal confrontation. Instead of retreating in fear, Emily began documenting more aggressively. Precise incident logs, secure cloud backups, even consulting local security footage. Grant started locking windows and double-checking the porch lights, but Emily's calm demeanor carried a strange confidence. When the invitation came for the Sunday final discussion at the lake dock, the handwriting was unmistakably Pam's. The location was telling too, isolated, away from houses, the perfect stage for a dramatic display of dominance. Yet on the day of the gathering, Pam wasn't hiding in shadows anymore. Neighbors were openly clustered around folding chairs like spectators at a show. Pam had transformed confrontation into community theater, confident she would humiliate the newcomers into submission before an eager audience. But Pam had underestimated Emily's patience, preparation, and most importantly, her profession. From the moment Emily walked alongside her father toward the pavilion, her demeanor seemed different. She wasn't just the quiet, detail-minded daughter unpacking boxes. Her posture was straight, her gaze calm, her voice collected. For the first time, Grant was beginning to suspect there was more to Emily's career background than she had ever told him. Pam started with fiery declarations, ranting about community standards and accusing Grant and Emily of defying harmony. She tossed around violation terms, waved documents, and smeared their character. Then Emily asked the first question, her tone calm and surgical. "Can you provide incorporation documents showing this HOA is legally recognized by the state?" The crowd went still. Pam faltered, danced around the question, blustered about respecting traditions. Emily didn't let up. She dug deeper, asking about financial audits, jurisdictional authority, and fiduciary duty. Each question chipped away at Pam's veneer, exposing the truth to every neighbor watching. Her authority had no anchor. Alan, trying to patch the holes, stumbled over his legal jargon, only making himself look less competent. Then the breaking point came. Frustrated by Emily's composure and rattled by the shifting doubt in the crowd, Pam snapped. With trembling rage, she pulled her firearm from her jacket and pointed it straight at Emily. The gasp from the neighbors rippled like thunder. Parents yanked children behind them. Phones shot up, recording instantly. The very woman who claimed to stand for order was now brandishing a weapon in front of dozens of witnesses. For a moment, time slowed. Grant felt his heart seize at the sight of his daughter in danger. But Emily didn't flinch. With an authority that somehow silenced even the panicking crowd, Emily's voice rose above the lake breeze. "Sheriff Emily Porter, lower your weapon immediately." The shock in Pam's eyes was visible even across the dock. She froze, realization dawning that she had just threatened not a problem neighbor but a law enforcement officer, while live-streamed no less, and in front of dozens of recording witnesses. Grant then stepped in, using his training to disarm Pam swiftly and handcuff her until backup officers arrived, sealing the moment. Chaos rippled in the crowd. Neighbors who had shrunk away from Emily during the harassment campaign now understood they had been manipulated by a fraudster. Phones captured every incriminating second. Pam's screams about being the law, Emily's calm commands, and the sight of a supposed HOA leader attempting armed intimidation. There was no denying it anymore. Pam Weston wasn't a community guardian. She was a criminal. Alan Harper, pale-faced and sweating, realized his scheme was crumbling too. As law enforcement took Pam into custody, he hurriedly packed up his laptop and papers, trying to slip away. But Emily had been expecting that. The very same night, his USB drive, intended to frame Emily with fabricated misconduct, was examined by digital forensics, revealing far more than he ever intended. Hidden files exposed templates for dozens of fraudulent HOA setups spanning multiple states. Alan had not just partnered with Pam. He'd been running a nationwide scam, cloning authority documents and filtering the money into personal accounts. What had begun as a lakeside quarrel had now exploded into criminal exposure. In a single confrontation, Pam's authority had been ripped apart under the blinding light of truth. The neighbors, once wary of Grant and Emily, now began whispering apologies, realizing they had been pawns in a scheme. And as Pam was led away in handcuffs, Emily's steady professionalism reassured them all. Real authority doesn't need to shout, intimidate, or threaten. Real authority simply speaks truth and stands on law. The sirens may have faded that night after Pam's arrest, but the echoes of her grip on the community lingered in the silence. Neighbors stood stunned, the dock lit not only by dim lamps but by dozens of glowing phone screens, each recording undeniable proof of Pam's descent into criminal behavior. For years, residents had been manipulated, threatened, and extorted. Now they were left blinking as though waking from a long sleep. The peaceful lakeside life had been restored in principle, but healing, both personal and collective, would take time. The following morning brought a different kind of chaos, not from Pam but from the wave of official presence arriving in the community. State representatives, law enforcement officers, and investigators began pouring through paperwork, interviewing residents, and reviewing the digital trail left behind by Alan Harper. The man who had carried himself with rehearsed bravado at the community meeting had unintentionally incriminated himself more thoroughly than anyone could have imagined. His USB drive, ironically meant to frame Emily, turned out to be the key that blew the lid off their entire scam. Hidden in his files were registration forms for multiple fake HOAs, fraudulent financial records, and evidence of payments funneled through personal accounts under different names. News spread quickly, and with it came media vans that parked along the lakeside entrance. Reporters interviewed residents, many of whom admitted they had been suspicious of Pam's aggressive tactics, but felt too intimidated to challenge her. That was the genius and cruelty of Pam's fraud. She had convinced ordinary people that resistance was futile. By calling herself the law, she created a culture of fear where silence seemed safer than confrontation. But now that fear was finally broken, residents began speaking freely, sharing stories of intimidation and illegal fees that had trapped them for years. One day, state officials revealed official survey maps proving the lake and surrounding lands had always been under state park authority. The deception shattered completely. Every rule Pam had barked, every fee she had forced, every violation she had documented, had been based on fabricated authority. In fact, the dilapidated sign Grant had noticed on his very first day, the one declaring lake maintained by state parks, wasn't just incidental scenery. It was the ultimate evidence that Pam had been operating a lie from day one, right under everyone's noses. The legal machinery moved swiftly once fraud was undeniable. Pam faced not only weapons charges for her armed intimidation, but also fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. Alan, whose attempt to smear Emily backfired spectacularly, was tied to multiple fraudulent communities across state lines and quickly faced federal-level charges. The so-called HOA was declared an elaborate scam, its documents and rules worthless compared to authentic state law. Within weeks, restitution orders forced the liquidation of their assets to repay thousands of dollars stolen from residents. Seeing Pam's fake compliance signs yanked out of the ground and thrown into the recycling truck was, for many, the moment they felt truly free again. Community dynamics began to shift as well. The same neighbors who once avoided Grant and Emily out of suspicion now approached them with gratitude and apologies. Conversations turned from hushed whispers about troublemakers to open acknowledgement of the courage it had taken to resist Pam's intimidation. For the first time, relationships between residents grew organically, free from enforcement, fueled instead by genuine cooperation. Families who once tiptoed around standards were now grilling together at the lakefront. Children splashed in the water without fear of punishments, and laughter filled spaces once dominated by threats. Grant, whose retirement dream initially seemed shattered by this ordeal, found an odd sense of renewal. In exposing Pam's fraud, he and Emily had uncovered more than just corruption. They had uncovered the capacity of the community itself to heal and grow strong in truth. His garage experience, dismissed by some as incidental, had provided vital observations during the fraud exposure. His trained eye caught details like inconsistent financial routing numbers and vehicle registrations. Ironically, his mechanic's pragmatism helped dismantle a national-level fraud. His neighbors, once wary, now sought him out not only for repairs but for his honest reputation, and his small business thrived in the wake of trust being restored. Emily, meanwhile, stepped fully into her dual identity. No longer just the careful daughter unpacking boxes, she was recognized openly as Sheriff Emily Porter. Her handling of Pam's escalating intimidation, her meticulous evidence collection, and her calm dissection of fraudulent documents earned admiration from peers and newfound respect from neighbors. The confrontation at the lake wasn't just a personal triumph. It became part of a much larger case against fraudulent HOAs, cited by federal investigators as a model of how to carefully document and expose organized community-level scams. The broader story didn't stop at their lakeside settlement. As authorities combed Allen's files, they discovered dozens of other communities where unsuspecting homeowners had been subjected to similar fraud. Elderly retirees, single parents, families saving for peace in rural areas, all had been preyed upon by the same scam model, convincing people they owed money to fake associations. Media coverage from Grant and Emily's case lit a spark, emboldening victims in other states to come forward and reclaim their voices. What had once been an isolated nightmare in one lakeside community became the unraveling of a much larger criminal enterprise. And yet, for Grant and Emily, while the legal cases expanded, home finally began to feel like home. Each day they watched the lake return to what they always believed it would be, a place of peace, where the mornings offered golden reflections on calm water instead of folded notices taped to doors. Their evenings were filled now with barbecues, porch talks, and laughter, instead of tense discussions over sabotage or threats. The cabin transitioned from a fortress under siege to the retreat they had dreamed of all along. Looking back, Grant recognized something profound. Pam had screamed, demanded, and threatened her way into control for years, but ultimately she was undone by the very arrogance she wielded against others. When faced with real authority, calm, steady, lawful authority, her sham crumbled like paper in the rain. Emily's quiet competence had tipped the scales, showing everyone that true legitimacy doesn't need volume or spectacle. It only needs truth, patience, and courage. In the end, the greatest victory wasn't Pam's arrest or Allen's exposure. It was the neighborhood's collective sigh of relief, a peaceful lakeside community breathing freely again, unchained from fear. Grant smiled as he stood by the water one evening, listening to the sound of children playing where silence once reigned. The dream was real after all. It had just taken one very long, very strange battle to claim it.